Trump is going to be no different than Biden. The US and China are going to have differing views. That's going to be escalated. China does not want it to be fully convertible at this point. That prevents a de-dollarization of the world. Now, we may move in that direction, but it's a long way away. Well, I think that in terms of a second Trump administration and China, there is certainly the potential, given Trump's campaign rhetoric, for a dramatic escalation of U.S.-China, of deteriorating U.S.-China relations very quickly, given that Trump has promised very high tariffs and there's a general bipartisan consensus in Washington of tougher measures towards China. The Biden administration also took quite tough measures towards China. On the other hand, Trump in his first term also promised quite not as tough measures against China as he is now, but pretty tough measures. And they wound up not being exactly quite as tough as he had originally promised. They were modestly tougher than the Obama administration, but they were nothing near what Trump had promised in the 2016 campaign trail. And I think that, Trump is a very transactional guy. And also he's very concerned about how he's viewed in relation to US markets, principally the stock market. And I think that were he to impose such an extreme tariffs on China, you would have massive economic problems all over the world. And the US stock market would reflect that with a massive slide. And so Trump would probably respond to that. So it's a little hard to tell, but if you can see from his first administration, some of the things he promised to do in general, he did do. Others he didn't do. So that's one aspect. I think that so I don't really expect 60% tariffs against China. The more concerning aspect would be that there are a lot of people around Trump who want to ramp up security and strategic pressure on China in the South China Sea, in other areas. And that could lead to a very dangerous game of escalation, and where even one modest sort of mistake between two ships or something like that could lead to a really dangerous situation. So I think that's probably more concerning than Trump's promises of massive tariffs, which would be enormously opposed by the US business community, which he does listen to. The Chinese government has spent years now, both through the first Trump administration, Biden, who took quite tough measures against China, and now a second Trump administration, taking efforts to somewhat insulate themselves from some degree of U.S. tougher measures. You can see that in a whole range of ways, including China's efforts to not be reliant on foreign suppliers for the highest level silicon chips, and to ensure more manufacturing, excuse me, and to provide subsidies for the highest level tech industries that China, like electric vehicles and others, as well as Xi Jinping's courting of a whole wide range of other countries that China did not have such a close relationship with before. Now, I understand that China and Pakistan have long had a very close relationship. Pakistan's probably been China's closest friend for decades. But there are other countries that Xi Jinping has turned to, as relations with the US have gotten worse, to sort of cultivate countries that he could rely on or work with or get support from if things were to get worse from China. So China's already preparing itself, I think, for a more divided world. And you see that with their closer relations with Russia, with their closer relations with a number of countries in the Middle East. They've been more assertive in some ways in their relations with countries in Africa. They've been more assertive in sort of trying to win over more friends in Southeast Asia. For the first time this year, in this sort of landmark survey that comes out every year of Southeast Asian elites, China was viewed more positively than the United States. So I think China has been preparing for this, and we'll have to see. I mean, Trump doesn't have a lot of clear principles. He's very transactional, which I think is something that China can deal with. It's just a question of, how they handle it. And I think it's also important to remember that in his last term, Trump sometimes had clear ideological visions about some things, but not very many. And he was often willing to alter those based on his personal relationship with certain foreign leaders. So, for example, even though Rodrigo Duterte had pursued, the former president of the Philippines, a relationship with China, he was trying to build a closer relationship with China, Trump didn't really hold that against him. He actually had a pretty close personal relationship with Duterte. So it's not impossible that Trump and Xi Jinping could sit down and that they could one-on-one work things out to some extent. Trump is very much in that mold of liking to see leaders face to face. So, I think it's hard to know, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the personal relationship with Xi Jinping does actually mitigate tensions, even though the general consensus in Washington, including many of Trump's advisors, is for a much tougher approach to China. I don't think there's going to be the trade war on the level of what people are saying, because it would simply be so anathema to the US business community and to the stock market that Trump would have to respond. In terms of a different currency, it's a very hard road to, I know that the BRICS and others would like that. Very, very, very tall order. I think that the Chinese currency is currently not fully convertible, which makes it impossible to serve as a reserve currency. China does not want it to be fully convertible at this point. So that prevents a de-dollarization of the world. Now, we may move in that direction, but it's a long way away. And remember that China holds a huge amount of U.S. treasuries, U.S. bonds. And to move away from that would be like if China was to sell off those, for example, that would be catastrophic. The US and China are sort of locked in this mutually assured destruction game. And if China was to sell all those off, it would certainly punish the US, it would destroy the US economy, but at the same time, it would destroy the Chinese economy. So that's sort of the situation that the two countries are in. So I think the BRICS does matter, but there are ways to do trade without dollars that we've seen increasingly, but as a reserve currency around the world, it's going to be really hard. Trump is going to be no different than Biden. The US and China are going to have differing views. That's going to be escalated. There are some areas where there could be cooperation, like issues related to climate, issues related to a ramping down of some degree of tensions in Southeast Asia. North Korea's nuclear program, unclear, frankly, whether China actually thinks it's a great idea for North Korea to ramp up its nuclear program. I mean, if you talk to Chinese officials, they themselves are quite worried about that. So there's actually, I think, some room on that for the U.S. and China to cooperate. Even though North Korea is China's formal ally, Chinese officials have always been worried about North Korea's actions sparking a regional war. They don't want that. There's probably some other realms of possible cooperation. China and India have lessened tensions somewhat since the border clashes. Possibly some room for greater cooperation there. Possibly some room for U.S.-China cooperation on Myanmar, which the war in Myanmar has really affected China quite badly. It has sent refugees into China. It's really hurt Chinese companies and investments. Maybe some room for cooperation there. China's quite unhappy with the junta government in Myanmar. So there are definitely areas of cooperation potentially. The biggest one being climate change. The problem on the climate change part is actually not as much China, although it somewhat might be China, but it actually would probably be more the Trump administration, which is not going to be very interested probably in focusing on climate change much at all. So.